Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. It's good to see you all so numerous here still. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch, which proves that there is such a thing as a healthy but also free lunch, providing, of course, you come to a Friends of Europe event, as you wisely have chosen to do so today. My name is Jamie Shea. I am a senior fellow here at Friends of Europe. I'm giving Dharmendra a well-deserved break after his excellent moderation of the sessions this morning. But don't worry, all of you Dharmendra fans, he is coming back after this session to moderate the final session of the day, dealing with space cooperation between the EU and Africa. But I suppose it takes a fellow to introduce a fellow, so that's why I'm here. And of course, I'll be introducing my colleague senior fellow, the author of the report that we're going to be discussing this afternoon, Paul Taylor, in just a moment. Now, the session overall today has been about making space matter. I would say that this particular session should be sort of retitled Making Europe Matter in Space, because that's what we are going to be talking about. Now, Paul Taylor doesn't really need an introduction from me. We've been friends for many years, but he's also, of course, a well-known entity on the Brussels and on the European scene. A former distinguished correspondent of Reuters for many years, diplomatic correspondent, EU correspondent, correspondent in Iran, the Middle East, so many countries. He has an enormous foreign policy portfolio. In more recent times, apart from being with us at Friends of Europe, and we're lucky to have him, he's also been writing a weekly column on Politico, which I imagine all of you read, particularly as Paul very kindly sends us his articles free, and therefore encourages us to do so, but they're always very good reads. Now, one of the things that Paul has done for us since coming to Friends of Europe is to write our peace, security and defence European security reports. Now, Paul, you know this, I've lost count, but Paul, I think, has done about a dozen of these by now, and some of them deal with particular countries, France, Germany, the UK. Others deal with regions. Paul has looked at the Black Sea, he's looked at the Sahel, he's looked at the High North, the Arctic. But occasionally he also looks at a more sort of sectorial, functional, sort of cross a domain issue. You will recall that he's looked at the European defence industry, for instance, and now he has looked at space. And whenever we ask Paul to write a report for us, we always sort of give him sort of four questions. The number one is, why is this issue important? You know, why now? You know, what has changed that suddenly means that the subject, Paul, of your next study has sort of gone to the top of the agenda? And of course, the thing about space is it's always been there, but it's always been sort of difficult to get to, very expensive to access, unless, of course, you're writing a science fiction novel or you're going to a movie like Star Wars. And therefore, because although it surrounds us and is vast and infinite and permanent, up until now there hasn't really been a sense that this vast area actually impacts very much on life on Earth. But so the first question to Paul is, you obviously think that's changing now, Paul, so why? Why should we care? Why does it matter? The second thing, as with any domain, is that we realise that it's, on the one hand, a global commons. It's something that is needed for all of humanity. None of us will survive in the future unless we can have the peaceful exploitation of space. I know climate change, monitoring, all of the other functions were mentioned in the session this morning. But unfortunately, there's no global commons, whether it be land, sea, air, or now the virtual world of cyber, which doesn't also give rise to a great deal of geopolitical rivalry and competition. So, you know, have we sort of lost the moment where we could still see space, like our oceans, as a global commons? and inevitably and reluctantly have to accept that it's now a domain of geopolitical rivalry and competition. The third question, which we always give to Paul, are, well, okay, but what are Europe's vital interests here? What are Europe's stakes? Can Europe sit this one out and still be the EU as we know it? Or does the EU now also have to have a stake in what's going on? And if a stake, what is it? Is it to be able to keep up with the commercial exploitation, the new space, the Elon Musks? Is it to get involved in what the EU is very good at, which is the regulatory side? Or is it because of the inevitable militarisation of space and ability also to have military capabilities and to defend itself in space as well? And then the final question always goes to Paul, is, well, what should Europe do? What are its strengths or weaknesses comparatively? Where are the gaps? What should be the priorities? And what should Europe do for itself as part of its strategic autonomy vis-a-vis doing with others? The US, of course, is a key partner. There are others too, Japan, perhaps India. Paul will enlighten us on this. And of course, NATO was mentioned too this morning. And of course, at the very end, we asked Paul to really put his sort of money where his brain is, and that is to formulate a series of recommendations, which I'm sure our panel will comment on. Now, Paul always does a very thorough job. He interviews hundreds of people. He's like Bob Woodward when it comes to getting people to open up and to spill the beans and to speak to him very candidly. And I know that makes his reports very, very readable, apart from the good journalist prose that he always uses. And that, of course, is not the exception this time either. But we have got three particular experts in the room today who are going to say whether they agree with Paul or don't agree, or what they agree with or disagree with, what struck them about this study, and what their own ideas are for how Europe can take its role in space forward. Let me introduce them. First of all, we have from Scotland, so not with us today, but in another very nice part of the world. In Scotland, we have Susmita Mohanty, who is the Director General at Spaceport, SARABHAI. She is a spaceship designer and a space entrepreneur, and the only one, according to my information, who's been able to have companies on 3 different continents. And she is originally from India, and so we've asked Susmita to not only give us her perspective as a space entrepreneur, but see how it all looks from India looking at Europe. Next, we have from the Netherlands, from Leiden University, Tanja Masson-Zwaan, who has come down today from the Netherlands, braving the strike and all of the traffic. So Tanja, very grateful to you for that. Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden. And so, as you can imagine, Tanja is very focused on those regulatory, legal, governance issues that I mentioned a moment ago, particularly as the co-founder of the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group. And then finally, we have one of our great friends and somebody who is really one of the big political figures in recent years on the Brussels scene, Ambassador Claude-France Arnould. Claude-France, where are you? I saw you. Yeah, there you are a moment ago. Claude-France, as everybody knows, has had a whole series of positions on behalf of France and the French Foreign Ministry, most recently Ambassador of France to Belgium. She's been a distinguished European public servant as well in the Council, dealing with crisis management, as Chief Executive of the European Defence Agency, and more recently, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we were very keen to have Claude-France join us today, a Special Envoy for Space for the European Union in the External Action Service. And thank you also, Claude-France, for making the trip to Brussels with us. So we've really got 3 of the best, Paul, for you today. They're going to give you a good run for your money. But first, I'm going to turn to Paul so that he, in 10 minutes or so, can present us with the main findings of his latest study. That will no doubt incentivize all of you to read it if you have not done so already. So, Paul, thanks for doing this most recent study for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. You know, the introduction, the build-up is far greater than I deserve. I have 3 answers to your 4 questions, or at least 3 main messages I want to give you out of this report. One is that there's a disaster building in low Earth orbit. And the question is, what do we do about it and how do we prevent it? This is the scary part of the day. This morning was kind of, you know, the sort of, you know, encouraging, optimistic, all what space can do for you part of the day. This is the scary part. Point 2, which I think Josef Aschbacher made very frankly in his introduction this morning, is that Europe has fallen behind in key areas of the space race, and that we risk running out of space, as the title of the report says. And point 3 is that Europe really needs to get real about space defense. And by and large, we're not there yet. So those are my 3 points, and let me try and elaborate a bit on each one. You'll find lots of other stuff in the report, some of which was very eloquently expressed this morning, for example, by Alfredo, on the problems of space entrepreneurship in Europe and how the ecosystem needs to change in order to convince entrepreneurs to stay in Europe and not take their inventions to America. So I won't dwell too much on that, but there's a whole section of the report on that which I would encourage you to take a look at. So let me start with the disaster waiting to happen. We know that there are more than 30,000 pieces of trackable debris larger than 10 centimeters long, whizzing around in space at speeds of about 3 kilometers a second. And there's a really growing danger as that debris proliferates that we'll get a chain reaction of collisions, what is called the Kessler syndrome, after Joseph Kessler, the NASA scientist who predicted this in the 1970s. It's a mixture of junk that fell off spacecraft, rivets and bolts, bits of launchers that didn't fall back to Earth as they're supposed to, meteorites, things that are up there because of space weather accidents, and of course, significant amount of debris that are a result of anti-satellite rocket tests, particularly by China and by Russia, which left large fields of debris that will be up there for decades. So the risk is that this chain reaction of collisions, this snowballing events in space could lead to making certain orbits unusable, effectively. And then all of the benefits that we get from space currently would be put at risk by that kind of chain reaction. And we're probably closer to that kind of chain reaction than many of us realize. And I think that's the big difference, I would say, between saving space and saving the planet is that there is no Greta. There is no Greta Thunberg protesting in the streets about space and space junk. There's no IPCC writing reports about it. There are no conferences of parties signing international agreements and making commitments on it. And therefore, it's a problem which so far is not really being tackled very much, except in rather arcane committees at the United Nations that move at a snail's pace. And I think that's something that I really want to draw attention to, because I think that we need to mobilize international concern and international action. And we also need to look at the whole issue of international regulation. That came out in many of the contributions this morning, that there is no international regulation currently of who can launch what, where. There are no allocated parking slots in low Earth orbit. There are no fines for littering. There's no IATA-like space traffic control or traffic cop. And we don't yet really have a space road sweeper. I'm not sure if I'm sitting too close. I'll try and move it slightly further away. And so, you know, we have a problem there without the tools that you would expect to have to solve it. And in a broader sense, I would say that space is one of those areas, like cyberspace or the metaverse, where technological advances have outstripped the regulatory framework. And regulation needs to catch up, and catch up fast, if we're to prevent potential disasters. The only laws that are really, really applicable in space are the laws of the jungle or of the Wild West. That's to say, first come, first served, and finders keepers. The fact is that since it's only nation states which license launches, there's no international authority which says who can launch what or where. And therefore, we're in this race to launch more and more stuff into low Earth orbit, but there's no sense of what the capacity, the overall capacity of low Earth orbit might be, or what a rational allocation of that space might be. Nobody's really talking about that, I think. And that's one of my big concerns, is that we're seeing a race for space that lacks the sort of guardrails. And it's true that we have the Outer Space Treaty, but the Outer Space Treaty and the agreements that followed it were made for another age. They were made for an age where you had two superpowers that were engaged in a space race. And basically they said you can't put weapons of mass destruction in space. But already some of the key principles of the Outer Space Treaty are being challenged. The Outer Space Treaty says that nobody can appropriate space or celestial bodies. But now we have national legislation in the United States, but also in Luxembourg, that says, well, actually, you can own things that you dig up in space. So how do you square that with the international law, with the Outer Space Treaty that says space is the common good of humanity, and nobody can appropriate? And so you've got these things which are partly interesting legal questions, but well beyond that. I mean, they could become very practical questions. Likewise, this whole question of nobody can appropriate space. In the agreements which the United States has reached with a number of partners, the so-called Artemis agreements, to preceding its Artemis moon landing program, in the middle of this decade, we're going to have a situation where security zones will be created, where there will be a presumption that if somebody approaches too close to where you have landed on the moon, that is sort of presumed to be hostile. So you can't appropriate space, but you can create exclusion zones. You know, these are I think more than just arcane legal questions. I think that these will be tested in practice quite soon, potentially. So these questions of what can you dig up in space, who owns it, who has a right to keep whom out of certain areas in space, and so on, I think will come to bite us in the behind quite quickly. My second message then is about Europe falling behind, and I'll skip quickly over that because Joseph was very upfront about the areas, or some of the areas, where we've fallen behind. We have, of course, great assets that make the EU a key player in space. Galileo, Copernicus, the Ariane and Vega launchers, the Kourou Spaceport, the EU Satellite Center. But we've fallen behind the United States in reusable and micro launchers, in satellite constellations, and really importantly in space situational awareness and space defense capabilities. What's space situational awareness? Well, it's it's knowing what's going on in space, being able to see what's happening in space. The fact is that for most European countries, the only way they know if their satellite's about to be hit by a piece of debris or a hostile satellite is if the American military tell them. Because most European countries have no capacity to see for themselves what's going on in space. Some countries find that entirely satisfactory. The United Kingdom, for example, is quite comfortable with the idea that the United States takes care of that. Oh, it's all right. You know, we're all sort of allies together, in the same way as the United Kingdom has never thought it was worthwhile to have its own military Earth observation satellites. It was quite happy to take that from the Americans as well, quite satisfied that it was getting whatever it needed, and that the Americans would not suddenly switch that off if there were things that they didn't want an ally to see. There are very different views within Europe about that, the opposite pole being the French, who wanted from very early on to have their own observation satellites and to be able to actually challenge the Americans, as they did in 2003 over Iraq, using their own observation satellite intelligence to question what the Americans were saying about Iraqi weapons, or alleged Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. So the overwhelming reason why Europe is falling behind, and I think we heard that this morning from people in industry and in the space agencies, is because of a dearth of public investment. It's not the only reason. There's also this whole question of the space ecosystem. I'll come to that in a second, which was very well described by our entrepreneurs this morning. But, you know, Europe is spending, if you want to be generous, about 8 billion euro a year. If you put together the money that the EU's spending, ESA's spending, and individual member states or individual nations are spending. The United States is spending $55 billion a year and has basically done so, or the equivalent, every year since the 1960s. So we know that China is spending somewhat less and getting a lot of bang for its buck. Perhaps our Chinese friends will tell us how they've achieved that, but it's certainly a bit of a puzzle. And so the EU has also had a difficulty, as we heard this morning, building and harnessing its pockets of excellence in new space due to a number of things, and I spell them out. There's a section of the report, short section of the report, that looks at the obstacles, the inherent obstacles to space entrepreneurship, to new space in the EU. But I mean, to summarize them, it's bureaucratic tendering procedures, often skewed towards large incumbents, slow patent registration, we heard that this morning,
Yep.
difficult access to venture capital, and procurement systems, as I said, that favor big incumbents and that actually include geographical dispersal as a policy objective, even where it is economically inefficient. So there's a lot, I think, that both the EU and ESA need to review there, and I've made a recommendation about that, and Joseph was actually quite responsive to that.
Paul, about 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah. So another thing that was unspoken this morning, but I think is fundamental, is that there is still an awful lot of mutual mistrust in the EU, and a lot of small-minded frugality. The mutual mistrust particularly is on sharing satellite intelligence with each other. It is perceived to be the crown jewels of national sovereignty, And so just as the United States has historically been relatively reluctant to share its satellite intelligence, and certainly beyond the Five Eyes group, the French, for example, have long been very reluctant to share their satellite intelligence and remain somewhat uneasy about it. But I think mentalities are changing. They certainly need to. Well, 2022, the good news is 2022 could be the year that the EU turns the corner. And we've heard this morning about the energetic proposals of Thierry Breton and Joseph Aschbacher to do that. And I think particularly the two areas which Thierry Breton has identified, secure connectivity, if it's done right, and we had a bit of a debate about that this morning, and space situational awareness and space traffic management. I think those are really the areas that Europe needs to work on. But we've got to be modest. We've got to be humble. We can't have the EU passing legislation and then going out to the world and saying, "This is what you've got to do." You know, we are the number 4, 5, 6 space power in the world, depending on how you calculate it. And we don't have quite the same market leverage with the single market as we do on chemicals or on data or on the various other things, GSM, where we have been able to impose our regulatory standards on the rest of the world. And when we tried one of the first diplomatic efforts of the External Action Service to achieve an international code of conduct for behavior in space, we ended up falling rather flat on our faces because of a perception that this was Europe coming out and telling the world what it should do, rather than starting by listening. Final point, EU needs to get real about space defense. While some member states have created military space commands and promulgated space defense strategies, others remain extraordinarily reluctant to treat space as a strategic domain. I mean, when you listen to Germany's new aerospace and space coordinator, she goes to extraordinary lengths to talk only about the environmental and commercial benefits of space and not the military implications. And I think that there's still a reluctance to address the fact that this is a military domain, a domain of potential conflict. Other powers, the United States, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, India, Israel, are actively developing counter-space capabilities, including anti-satellite ground-launched weapons, laser dazzlers, satellites that approach and intercept or could intercept or inspect your satellite, in-orbit directed energy weapons, as well as cyber attacks on Western space systems. Europe is doing nothing in this area and pursuing arms control and codes of conduct without furbishing its own defenses. And I think that's an illusion. France, I think, is the key exception here, and leads the way in Europe to Europe's modest capabilities in space situational awareness. I mean, the absolute beginning is knowing having eyes, being able to know what's going on in space.
Okay.
Two more points. I know I'm running slightly over time. The French have also done space defense exercises. They've developed capabilities for defensive, passive space defense. Ideas like, for example, surrounding your key assets in space with constellations of microsatellites so as to make it harder to attack or approach. And the French are working on a potential counter-space deterrent. Their self-imposed restriction is they won't do anti-satellite weapons that destroy satellites and create debris, but they are looking at laser dazzlers. The Ukraine war shows us just how important space is for conflict on Earth. As you know, on the very first day of the war, Russian hacking took down the Viasat satellite link, downlink, that was used by the Ukrainian armed forces, breaking a lot of their connectivity. And as you also know, Elon Musk came in very quickly and provided Starlink terminals that enabled the Ukrainians not only to network their firing systems and so on, but also to keep the extraordinary flow of information and videos and so on coming out from around the country, keep their mobile phone networks and internet networks going, and that's tremendously important in this war. And of course, that was tremendously important for strategic communication. You also saw, for the first time really to this extent, commercial sector imagery of near military quality that was available for a few $1,000s. You could get pictures. So it largely removed the element of strategic surprise from the Russian invasion, because you could buy pictures from Maxar or from Planet.
Well, you put a lot out there, so one sentence then to
All right.
wrap up for now, because you're going to come in later on, but we've still got our three experts, and we've
So
got
I
an
would
audience
say
that want to ask questions. So give you a sentence just to wrap up there.
My final sentence, which is two sentences, would be what Europe needs is passive space defenses, things like maneuverability, microclusters to shield these assets, more resilience and redundancy, constellations, quantum encryption, all these sorts of things. But somewhere we also need to think about a space deterrent. And that space deterrent, I think, will be national and not European. I don't believe that we'll go as far as to have a European collective space deterrent. But I do think we'll have a division of labor where ESA provides the scientific know-how, tendering experience, and so on. The EU provides enablers, including the military channels of Galileo and Copernicus and so on. And member state, and crucially, partnership with NATO. And we can perhaps talk about more.
Yeah, we could talk about, Paul, thanks. So,
Q&A.
Paul, there's so much to be said about space. It's infinite, and what you could say about it sometimes can be infinite as well, because there are so many different dimensions, and you referred quite rightly to all of those different dimensions that the EU needs to come to grips with. You said Europe is falling behind, but you also optimistically suggested there are ways that Europe can and should catch up. Though let's go directly to the experts. Now, before I hand over the microphone to Susmita, just please, everybody in the audience, as always at a Friends of Europe debate, Q&A, interaction, discussion, good sharp questions, so please start getting them ready. And that applies also to those of you who are watching us online today. I can't see you, but I know you're out there, and the way to ask a question, the ways are very simple. You raise your hand online, or you come in on the chat, so that our collaborators here can pick that up, and they will feed to me the fact that you wish to intervene. So this, the questions, the discussion is not just for the people who are physically present. So please take advantage of that. I just wanted to say that. So Susmita, you very carefully listened to Paul, and I know that you've read the report because you told me so, and I believe you. Of course I do. And I know that you're very interested in this link between space policy and climate change policy. I know that you'll probably be quite provoked by what Paul said about the risks of losing access to low Earth orbit. And I mentioned earlier that you bring to this the perspective of somebody who's worked around the world in India, but are now, as we can see from that lovely scene behind you, in Bonnie, Scotland. So Susmita, what's your take on what you heard from Paul? The virtual microphone is yours. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. So I totally agree with Paul. I think juxtapositioning the climate crisis with the debris menace that we have now in low Earth orbit is quite appropriate. In the case of climate, I personally believe that we have already crossed a tipping point or two. In the case of space, if you look at what is creating this large amount of debris, I would attribute it to four main things. One is, of course, the mega constellations. So when we say a mega constellation, it's not a small constellation of a couple of dozen satellites, but rather a couple of thousand satellites. And in the case of mega constellations, I think if you particularly take the case of Starlink, which is being launched by SpaceX, the intended size of that LEO constellation is going to be 42,000 spacecraft. And I think we have to wait and watch, but I think the Starlink probably will be that tipping point that might completely take us into dangerous territory as far as low Earth orbit is concerned. The other three things which I think are of concern in terms of debris proliferation are anti-satellite tests, too many rocket launches, usually the fourth or the last stage of the rockets. They usually leave behind, rocket shards and leftover parts. The other thing that we cannot turn a blind eye to is casual space tourism. I mean, we've recently seen Bezos and Branson blast off into suborbital space. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Let's talk a little bit about what I think entrepreneurs, especially new space entrepreneurs who are planning constellations, not just in the United States, but other parts of the world as well. We have a company in India that is planning a constellation of hyperspectral satellites, as an example, is that those of them who are flying or will fly their satellites in low Earth orbit should take on the responsibility of deorbiting this dead satellites within, say, 1 to 3 months, rather than wait for years. That's something I think every space company should sign up in terms of code of conduct. The other thing that we see in the space industry today is a lot of pushback from wealthy companies and large companies in terms of having a legal backbone to ensuring that debris is deorbited. So what I'm trying to say is we cannot run the show with just altruistic principles. We need regulations, we need penalties for littering, and that's something, there's a lot of pushback, we see that in the industry, and that needs to be overcome. The other thing to keep in mind is something called the Space Sustainability Rating, which is being created collaboratively under the World Economic Forum, and that is a market-based rating, which could be creatively used for incentives, financial incentives for companies who sort of follow the best practices in delittering. So that's something. And let's talk about Europe a little bit. I mean, I've had the opportunity to work for at least a couple of decades now with the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, and the Indians. So I do agree with what Joseph, I believe, said in an earlier panel, that Europe has fallen behind, and that didn't happen yesterday. I've been observing the fact that Europe often tends to piggyback on NASA and NATO, so to speak. And I think it's about time that Europe took a leadership position and started investing very deliberately and carefully for three different things. One is safety, of course, where Europe should have its own constellation for space situational awareness. Second, I think Europe should think through the cyber vulnerability of their space assets, especially given the Ukraine conflict. That should be a wake-up call. And the third is Europe should take leadership in not only endorsing the space sustainability rating that the World Economic Forum has put together, but also in creating an international body that takes up the task of cleaning up some of the dead satellites in orbit. Let me give you some statistics just to give you a sense of how dangerous the situation already is in LEO. We've had about roughly 6,000 launches from the 1960s onwards. We have launched as a collective worldwide. We've launched, let's say, roughly 12,000 satellites. I'm rounding off numbers here just for impact. There are 7,200 satellites still orbiting the Earth, of which only 4,300 roughly are functional. So that'll give you a sense of how many dead satellites we have. And if you go by the numbers on European Space Agency's Space Debris Office website, we have nearly 330 million man-made debris objects in space, of which we are actively tracking somewhere between 26,000 and 28,000 objects. So the situation is really, really serious. And I think within the decade, LEO will be a very, very dangerous place for us, collectively speaking.
Susmita, I can give you, I apologize for interrupting, but 1 minute if you don't mind, just for these introductory thoughts, just to wrap up, so I can give the floor to our other two speakers. You'll, of course, come back in several times during the discussion.
Okay, so I think there's one last point. Other than Europe taking a leadership position, I think the second thing is I think Europe should keep up multilateralism as opposed to unilateralism that we are starting to see in the case of countries like Luxembourg or the United States that are unilaterally legislating things related to space utilization and exploitation. So with that, Jamie, I'll hand it back to you.
Susmita, thank you very much indeed. And again, some interesting observations, largely agreeing with what Paul was saying about the dangers of congestion in low Earth orbit. Some interesting thoughts, though, about deorbiting and sort of corporate social responsibility when it comes to cleaning up your old satellites and the mess and how business could be incentivized to do that. So thank you very much from that perspective, and fascinating statistics. So we now go to Tanja. Tanja, I've introduced you already. I said that you cover, amongst many other things, the regulatory aspects. I mean, Paul spoke about space as the jungle or the wild, wild west. Would you agree with that? Is it quite that anarchic? Do you think that the EU does have a big role to play in dealing, for example, with the weaponization of space? Paul's suggestion was that the EU could only do it with partners. And so who do you think those partners would be? Anyway, some questions from me, but the microphone, you don't need a virtual microphone because you have a real one. So the floor is now yours for your comments.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and I'm happy to be here in person in this important event to celebrate the launch of this important study, and congratulations to Paul on writing that. And also want to mark, which I often mark the contrary thing, but here I want to mark it in a positive way, that all your experts are female, so we don't have a man panel as we so often have. Thank you for that. So yes, I agree with most of what is in the report, absolutely. However, as Paul might expect, I will have to give a contrary voice to space being the wild, wild west and an unregulated territory, because it is not. And there is a set of rules and regulations that have kept outer space peaceful for 60 years of its exploration and use, and that system is working. You can, of course, criticize that by saying it's hard to enforce the rules, and it doesn't mean anything because it's all private industry now, and all those kinds of arguments. But there is a system of international responsibility of states, of peaceful coexistence, of peaceful use of outer space, of recognizing that space can bring great benefits to humankind, and various ways to preserve that. And we have to be realistic. We, as far as we know, there are no huge big weapons in outer space, and we haven't had a war in space. The fact that space is militarized is, of course, well known. We cannot deny that space started as a military domain already in the 1960s and 50s. So, but that doesn't mean that it is that we have wars in space, and let's hope that we can keep it that way. Of course, the internal European landscape has to be recognized. We have two international organizations, the EU, but also the European Space Agency, which have to work together as two separate entities with not all the same member states, with very different procurement systems. So that is very complex already for us inside Europe, but also for the outside world, it's sometimes hard to understand. And besides the organizations, you have the member states, and you have the role of industry stakeholders, and all those have a role to play. I think also that we have to look at increasing the transparency, the importance of space, not only within our own community. We all know how important space is, but we have to also, let's say, preach outside the choir. We have to make much more clear to the international community how strategically important space is for our everyday life. And I think if we can do that, we can also get more political clout in increasing our defense of space and the strategic interests that we have there. In terms of how to move forward, I think that it's important that we focus on substance over format. You hear a lot of debates about, oh, it's impossible to get a new treaty. Since the Moon Agreement of 1979, there hasn't been a new treaty, and that's a failed treaty because only 18 member states. And I do agree that it is probably not realistic to say that we're going to have binding rules, binding rules on debris remediation or mitigation. But I do see clear trends coming from the industry, and Susmita referred to the space sustainability rating, but also the Net Zero Space Initiative launched by the Paris Peace Forum last year. And other movements, and I experienced that a little bit in the Hague Space Resources Working Group that you referred to. I think industry is very well aware also of the strategic challenges and of the fact that, yes, of course, they want to move forward, but they also need a clear regulatory framework, which is in the interest of their business case, obviously. So we see things moving, and we see them voluntarily signing up to a space sustainability rating. Of course, there have to be incentives in the sense that they might get a cheaper insurance rate and things like that. But you do see it happening, and so I think that there is some hope. There are certain, and when I say substance over form, we have to concentrate on states using the legal system at their disposal. When we see that states have problems caused by the fact that, for instance, Elon Musk has 40,000 satellites and astronomers cannot see the clear skies, there is a mechanism in international law. International law says that if there is a risk of harmful interference of the activities of one state with the activities of another state, they can request international consultation. So let's use those mechanisms, which have not really been used so far, and let's use the one and only international global forum that we have dealing with the peaceful uses of outer space, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, much more actively. And I think that if we do that, that is really the only forum where all states come together, including Russia and China and let's say the difficult states which create so much issues and problems. I think I'll leave it to that for now. But
that was crystal clear, and thank you. You said it's not quite the wild, wild west, not yet. You also, like Paul, stressed this need for public education and awareness, the Greta Thunberg effect, the substance over format, the importance of industry, and the very important idea that there are legal instruments, existing mechanisms out there that we need to use better and more frequently. So thank you. The third expert, as I mentioned, is Ambassador Claude-France Arnould. I introduced her already, so Claude-France, again, welcome and thank you for coming today. As somebody who has spent your career promoting, defending the European Union, as well as, of course, as your mother country, France, and you were the special envoy of the EU on space. Do you agree with Paul's rather pessimistic conclusion about Europe falling behind? How did you see it from your vantage point here in Brussels? European strategic autonomy, what does that look like in space, which I think was another issue that Paul broached. And Paul was advocating quite a significant investment in military capabilities for defence purposes. Would you support that? And again, also that question, you having been, of course, a representative both for France and the EU, what would be the mix of where you think this would be provided by national capabilities and what the EU should do in common? So lots of elements for you too, Claude-France, and now the microphone is yours for your comments. Thank you for waiting patiently as well. You take, I know that you could say a lot in 6 minutes, Claude-France.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here because it doesn't happen so often in a professional lab. I totally agree with everything that has been said before, and totally agree with the remarks of that Paul described in his report. Yes, it is pessimistic. It is alarmist. But I think what is important is that there is volonté d'agir, and we have to do something, and I think we can do something, and that is what I understood from your report. You mentioned strategic autonomy. Should strategic autonomy be regarded as a French agenda, as Paul wrote and said? Yes and no. I think in a way, yes, and particularly if you oppose this perception with the British perception. Yes, you said that, for instance, for a Brit, it's not about, for the British politicians, it's not an issue to rely entirely, not a problem to rely entirely on the US. It's not a problem, it's not a vulnerability. For the French it is. But, well, for the EU, strategic autonomy is now one of the objectives. It's clearly one of the main elements of the strategic compass. But behind that, there is also a fundamental choice, even in deterrence, I mean nuclear deterrence, in intelligence. In the case of the United Kingdom, the choice was from the very origin to have a very strong link on the Trident, but also on Five Eyes, and of more independence on the French side. But what is important is the rest of Europe, I think, and the way they will choose strategic autonomy. And I think they will only be convinced on strategic autonomy if we get rid of the suspicions you rightly mentioned. First suspicion, the French want to fund French firms and secure France's place as #1 in the field of space. And this suspicion really exists in Germany in particular. Have the Germans pay for the French industry, and also in the rest of Europe. And there is an even more greater preoccupation, greater concern, is that strategic autonomy should not mean being less dependent from the Americans, which is the main choice of most of the Europeans. Peace thanks to the American, protection thanks to the American, and be dependent from the French or the Germans or both, which is not acceptable for the rest of the Europeans. And I think that is something on which we French and we German have to work on very carefully. Demonstrate that strategic autonomy means, I like the British word for strategic autonomy. When I was in EDA, I always had to change strategic autonomy for freedom of action. And that's fine, freedom of action. Then have freedom of action, greater freedom of action, and greater protection through freedom of action for all EU member states. And that's why I think, and I totally concur with Paul's conclusions, the bigger player in the field of space in Europe, than relatively big players in Europe, that are France, Germany, Italy, must play in a European, EU, and ESA framework. And I think it is something that is really important. What will be done has to be done through European programs and European action. And I think that, and same thing for defense. I think we will be able to convince other member states that we can improve our capabilities in defense, and we should do it based on European instruments if we can show that we do it really with European instruments. Third remark, I think it's important also to demonstrate what is, for me, absolutely obvious, is that strategic autonomy, in fact, is greater resilience. European strategic autonomy is greater resilience. And I think, as you recall in your report, that is what the Americans demonstrated in their position vis-à-vis Galileo. Initially, the Americans were totally against Galileo. They did everything to jeopardize Galileo. At the same time, there were real warnings that we had to take into account, and we did take these American concerns into account, particularly as regards security and safety. But when I was Special Envoy for the External Action Service, I went to the Pentagon and I went to the National Security Council, and they said, well, Galileo is very important, and even PRS, public-related signal, is important because it is redundancy and it is less vulnerability. And I think it's true now for all our technologies in the field of space. We have a tremendous vulnerability, and the more redundant between allies we are, the better. And when you say that we piggybacked on the Americans, and it's really time to have to develop our capabilities, and of course to do it in a cooperative way. I think also we need to combine, and you show it in your report, regulation and capabilities. I was surprised at what I heard from the Portuguese responsible for space agency, that it should be only procurement and services. I'm not convinced on that. I don't think services are enough. I think market is very important, but not only services. And I think we have to be very careful. We are very happy about SST consortium, but if we are too self-satisfied, we won't have additional capabilities. And Paul said rightly that the capabilities presently are 80%, 90%, I don't know. And if I knew, I wouldn't say. American, Pentagon, some French military capabilities, some German military capabilities, but it's not enough. And then we have to develop these capabilities. And I think we should not be satisfied only with having a service. We need also more capabilities, including defense capabilities. Then I come to defense. I am absolutely convinced that we cannot have a frontier between civilian space and military space. And one of the reasons why we are late is that we, opposed to all the others, American, Chinese, Russians, we wanted to have part of our effort only civilian. When I was EDA chief executive, I signed an arrangement on cooperation with ESA, because ESA could not deal with defense. And it was funny because Dordain was a specialist of defense. I was a civilian. I am still a civilian. But I represented the military side, and ESA could not, except through this cooperation with European Defense Agency, deal with the military or defense issue. I think that is going to be over. There is this famous site vendor, or this revolution in the mindset that we have because of the war in Ukraine. And I think that because of that, we have really a chance to get rid of the taboo about defense, taboo in funding, get rid of taxonomy and threatening the funding of defense activities and thus of space activities, because again, they are necessarily mixed.
Yeah.
And then be able to rely on our 2 feet, defense and civilian aspects, because really, if there is a domain where it cannot be separated, it's space. I think also that we have to rely on all our structures, Of course, it's strange to have a European Space Agency, ESA, and to have a European Program Space Agency, EUSPA, in Prague. Nobody can understand that. But
that's the way it is, so make them work together.
Yes, it's a way. And, but what matters is really to have all that together. I mentioned EDA. I really think that we need to have defense programs. I think that it could be financed through the community funds, but I think also we can rely on the way in EDA you can have member states working together with the appropriate military framework. And last remark, it's perhaps the only point on which it's not disagreeing with Paul. It's a terrible doubt about more funding. We will need now more funding in the EU budget, in the member states' budget for everything, for the debt we have because of tragic circumstances, COVID. And tomorrow, perhaps next week, we will say to Ukraine that they are a candidate. Then reconstruction, cost of such candidates.
Integration.
And health and everything. Then I think we must have funding, I agree, but we must have more than funding. And the question of market is more difficult. Of course, as a French, you would be surprised if I don't mention the word preference, but in a way, you cannot be the only one not to have a preference for yourself. Yeah. Again, and considering also a reciprocity, then I think we must be concerned about the question of funding. We would need funding, but we need more than funding. Regulation, we need innovation and what you propose to support startups and then private funding, because we will be short of money.
Claude-France, thank you very much. Those were a very good set of remarks, expected, very also political as well as expert. And the volonté d'agir, looking at strategic autonomous freedom of action, using all of the mechanisms that we have, the more redundancy, the better. You know, the civilian-military interface doesn't make sense and can hold us back. And the idea that in a tight environment, we obviously have to look at different commercial market mechanisms to provide the investments we need, because state budgets are going to be very, very tight. But you also are plaidoyer for developing more of the military capabilities. Paul, the good news is that the experts largely bear you out in terms of your findings and your analysis. I'll ask them a little bit later on if the recommendations that you put at the end of the report, if they had to select just one that they personally would want to see implemented before 6 o'clock this evening, which one that would be. Paul, you've listened to the debate, and at the end I'll give you a chance just to give us your final takeaways. But ladies and gentlemen, the audience, you've patiently waited, so it's your turn now to ask questions. I know that many of you spoke this morning, but if you don't mind once again giving your name and affiliation for those people who have only joined us after lunch for this session, that would always be helpful. Sir, I recognise you first, the microphone is coming, but please everybody be ready. We have about 30 minutes and we can have a good discussion in that time, so please.
Angelos Harlaftis. I can say I can represent, because I created in 2008 the Urania and Helios Space and Defence Group, European and Mediterranean group strictly. I agree very much with, very much.
Could you put the microphone, not in your mouth, that would be uncomfortable, but very close to it so that we have better acoustics.
It's the first time here in Europe I hear a voice like yours and supporting my proposal, which is based in the French government's 1954 treaty for the creation of the European Defence Community. This is the solution. Speaking about leaderships, for space and other sectors, it's a dream. We cannot lead with this union. This union is an economic union. It was created in this way. It is a respect to the founding fathers to keep it in this way, as there are involved other parties, allies, which we respect them, we want them, but we cannot have in our lands, if we want to have autonomous solutions, anything else apart from the European
May I
defense.
respectfully,
It's very important.
good comments,
Yes.
good comments, but given the time, sir, could I
Yes,
ask you respectfully
the
just to
European-
put it, please, in the form of a question, please, and then we can bring in the panelists.
As you
to
understand, I am not an expert like the gentleman, but
put your question, put it in the
the
question.
question is not a question. From this, you can understand that we have the ExoMars failure of us. We took it from NASA. I spoke to the previous administration. Did you have any research why we lost our rover? And they put me out. So,
sir, the personal reminiscence, forgive me, is
the
good,
thing
it's
is that we
interesting,
can have-
but we need a question, so because we have other people who want to come
so
into the
do you
debate as
think?
well.
Do you think that this union can be a leader, or it can be another union which only the concilium will be the joint?
Okay, that's
Thank
good.
you.
So thank you. We have a question there, so it's possible to put it in the form of a question. Thank you. So let's see who else would like to come in, please, in this first round to ask a question. Yes, do we have the gentleman there? Thank you.
Cécile May from SES, the European space satellite company based in Luxembourg. From our point of view as a private actor, our fundamental concern is access to space. And we fear that at some point, if we leave all these mega constellations made up of tens of thousands of satellites, building a complete belt around the planet, there will be a fundamental issue. And that will not be only ours, it will be an issue for other actors. We operate geostationary and medium Earth orbit satellites. These are essential. We cannot only rely on LEO. That is a dream. We talk a lot about LEO, but GEO and MEO have characteristics and actually options and possibilities which are, to some extent, very complementary and much better than LEO. So my question is, can we make sure that when we talk about this question of occupation of space, we take into consideration the need to maintain the option of access to space to the various altitudes. We make sure that whatever happens at the LEO level, it's still possible to access MEO and GEO, 8,000 kilometers or 36,000 kilometers above the Earth. This is essential.
Thanks very much. So good point. It's not just about low Earth orbit. There's more space than that also needs to be able to exploit it. So we've got two questions there. Before I go back to the panel, is there a third question? There is indeed. Please, the microphone is coming.
Very short one. So it was mentioned here that it doesn't make sense to have European Space Agency and the political Space Agency of the Commission. So which one you think is redundant here? We should have a more politically directed Space Agency, or just run with the ESA, which is not a space agency in a classical, it's a consortium of countries, which kind of, so you said that. Are you saying no? No, you said that why we have two, or it's not understood why we have two.
Okay, so if you have to choose, which way would you go? No, thank you, that's very good. So I will go first to Susmita, who's patiently waiting online, still by her Scottish locker, though it does seem it's not raining in Scotland for once. Susmita, probably a good question for you about this idea of access to orbits apart from low Earth orbit. And how we've been speaking about low Earth orbit, but how does the situation look in the higher echelons, as it were? I think maybe that's a good question to you. Then I'll turn to Claude-France, because she was asked a specific question about which agency, although she did say that we should work with all of them, but you did ask her a direct question. And then the gentleman at the back who asked, is this current union up to the task, as it were? Paul and Tanja, of course, I'm giving you an opportunity too, but one has to start somewhere, so let's start with Susmita, please, to respond. First. You're on mute. Susmita, can you hear me? You have to press the demute button or unmute. That's
yes.
Right.
Sorry
We've got
about
you.
that.
No.
Yeah. So I totally I love the question that's been posed by my fellow space colleague at SES. I think the focus on debris in LEO has overwhelmed us, and we have nearly, well, I wouldn't say we have forgotten, but we shouldn't forget that geo is probably an equally important or even more important orbit for a lot of the applications, a lot of our space assets. I would also like to point out that geo too has a problem of a first come, first serve slot occupation, which is a problem that's been lingering for decades. That's something as a space think tanker I would like us to address. As for MEO, I do think it is important, and access of course is important, but I think in terms of applications, we really have to keep GEO in our crosshair as much as we are keeping LEO on our radars. Thank you.
Okay, Susmita, thank you very much for that answer. So Claude-France, to you for the two questions that really were for you.
Thank you. Now, I said that it's complex and that people don't understand. I didn't say that we should get rid of one. And I don't think so. And I never said that the Commission is political. That is for the President of the Commission to say that. Mrs. von der Leyen does. I don't. Perhaps it's my French tradition. Well, the European Council has a political responsibility. But I think it's not your question. In an ideal world, I think we could have one single European space agency. Today, we cannot, because the format is different. In one case, you have more member states in ESA, and you have other member states, by the way, in the EU that you have in ESA. Then be it only the question of the format, it's not the only question, there are many other questions, but we should, be it only the question of the format, and particularly the UK, you cannot solve the issue now. And I think you can live with that. And it will be also my answer to the second question, to the first question. You can live with that. You can have the operational responsibility with the USPA, with the agency in Prague. And you have the research and technology and the development of programs with ESA. And because I mentioned the military part, I think you could have that also in the defense sector with EDA, European Defense Agency. And I think we can live with this complexity. Of course, it's a problem of communication vis-à-vis the citizens, but it's about everything in the European Union, this question of communication. But I think we can live with that, and we have no choice. That's why also I think this European Union is fit to do something quickly significant. And I am absolutely convinced, be it on space, be it on defense, that we should not wait for the dream world where we would have an ideal European Union. For the time being, we have the instruments, we have some money, a lot of money, not enough, but a lot of money. And we have different structures, and we can do the job. Then let's not wait for the next revision of the treaties or for the next area. And I think we have the European Union fit for the action we need to take now because of the risk you mentioned and the disaster you mentioned, and you illustrated.
Claude-France, thank you very much. Now, just as I ask other questions, we also do have a question on a video that was put to us by one of our young political leaders participating in Debating Europe. So if all's going well technically today, which I fervently hope, we should see the video and the question up right now. So please go ahead. I'll step aside so that everybody can hopefully see our question on video.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, what I would like to be included, maybe to assist Africans, is to have a space curriculum for the kids, yeah, and also even for those in the secondary schools, having space curriculum. I think it's good, even for the university programs, to actually have real astronomy and space courses to be carried out, and as well as to have some kind of policy and funding initiatives that starts from grassroots, not only within maybe the urban communities, but also even starting from the rural communities up to the adults. Having those space communities is really something which needs to be looked at, and also having to look into the nexus between energy and agriculture as a means to solve Africa's problems.
Okay, thank you. That was a question, Tanja, looking at you, because it concerns education about space issues. The gentleman there obviously was talking about Africa, but I think the point he was making, and Paul made this, is, how can we generate through education, curricula on space, more university courses, maybe the kind of sort of awareness that we've been trying to develop when it comes to cyber skills and the like. I mean, you clearly coming from the university world probably know quite a lot about this, and you have quite a background. So give us a sense of how it's going, and particularly if you've done anything, for example, with African universities or centers of education.
Absolutely important, and I had actually written down capacity building on my note jotting here when we were talking about the issue of the difficulty to understand ESA and USPA and community and EDA and all that. A lot goes into education and transparency and communication, and we've mentioned it before, and Paul addressed it also in his report. That is essential, and the interdisciplinarity of it is also essential. We should not only have lawyers talk to lawyers or engineers talk to engineers, but you also have to go across the disciplines and make these communities communicate with each other, which is not always easy. You have to speak each other's language. You have to listen to each other, and there are certain initiatives such as International Space University, which does that, which has 7 different disciplines going from humanities and engineering to social sciences and law and everything. And I think that really makes a big difference, and they unite all areas of the world in various courses. So I think that is something that we always have to pay attention to, and I come again back, maybe if I may, to the UN, because they organize capacity building courses and seminar series in all areas of the world where you can get groups together and do this outreach. So absolutely agree that it is important. In Leiden we have a master program. I have one of my students here even, and we have students from all over the world, and the joy of seeing them interact with each other and seeing the different communities trying to understand each other's concerns is wonderful. I can give one example about space resources. I had a student from South Africa, and I was saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get platinum from outer space and bring that back to Earth, and we would drop the price significantly, and that would be wonderful for the energy crisis here on Earth. And he said to me, yeah, but you're going to spoil our main source of income from natural resources, or you're going to really affect the international markets. And that is a perspective that I hadn't thought about. And so I think that exchange and that interchange is extremely important.
Good, and you don't have any trouble finding students who want to sign up for space courses.
You have so many people who space is exciting, and more people are getting interested and find their ways to Leiden or other courses that you have. So yeah.
Thank you. Paul, I'll keep you waiting if you don't mind just for the moment, because we do have a question from somebody who's been following us online, Mr. Abdul Haq, if I've got it correctly, who has raised his hand. So hopefully, Alessandro, Lena, we can bring him up on the screen, or at least have the audio. Mr. Haq, please unmute yourself and put your question. If it's to a particular person on the panel, please say so. Over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Loud and clear. Go ahead.
Thank you so much to give me this opportunity to share some idea. I am from Algeria. I'm from Tlemcen University. I am very interesting to know how European Union about the space can exchange with North Africa, especially with South Mediterranean country, because we have the same vision and the same destiny. But I think the internship between them is a little bit not efficiency. Can you give us, because I am younger and I'm looking for the future, how you can improve this partnership? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting question. Claude-France, when you were the EU space envoy, you mentioned, of course, you were in the Pentagon in the US, which is a natural sort of place to go to discuss these issues. But did you see any incipient cooperation, for example, with Africa, North Africa? We're going to, of course, be addressing this issue. Mr. Haag, please stay online because, as you know, the next session is going to address this issue most specifically, but at least in terms of, how far your sort of diplomacy global extended in that position.
In fact, I'm sorry, my mission was rather limited to Galileo and the security
Understood,
part of Galileo, and
yeah.
we are hurrying to finalize the paperwork and the decisions on this security part of Galileo. Nevertheless, one thing I could say is that EGNOS was particularly and is particularly used by African countries for the safety of airports and and I suppose the Commission knows more than I do. And I'm convinced, and I think it was addressed at the Africa Summit at the beginning of the semester, that in the new partnership between the European Union and Africa, space is one of the very important domains. And I'm absolutely convinced about that. And what I did 2 years ago, again, was more limited than that.
Understood.
But what we have to do today and tomorrow, I think space is a very important part of our partnership with Africa. And we have the instruments, and in the Commission, as in particular the instrument with the different post-Cotonou, when it's settled.
Thank you. Anything to add? So, yeah.
No, maybe just to mention this initiative of the secure connectivity.
Get the microphone here.
I work at the European Commission Joint Research Center. Maybe just want to mention that this initiative of Commissioner Breton on secure connectivity, he also announced this gateway to Africa.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. While we're talking about partners, Susmita, bringing you back before it starts raining up there in Scotland, as it always does in the afternoon. I did mention, of course, that you have the good experience of India, which, of course, is now a more and more active space power. But you also, of course, know Europe very well. So I know the question from Mr. Hack was, of course, on relations between Europe and Africa. But how do you see cooperation developing, if it's developing at all, between India and Europe? From your perspective on both sides. I wouldn't like to end the session today, at least without getting your views on that.
Yeah, certainly. So let me clarify for those of you who are not familiar with the Indian space program, that we are pretty much one of the oldest space programs in the world. We did our first experimental rocket launch back in 1963. So we shouldn't be clubbing India into emerging space nations.
Understood.
We are a handful of countries that can launch their own satellites into space. And as far as European cooperation is concerned, I see very active collaboration between the French Space Agency and ISRO, which is the Indian Space Agency. We have together launched a series of satellites, not only looking at climatic studies for Earth, but we've also, France and India, the cooperation and the friendship goes back to the 60s when India started developing its rocket technology. So the Viking engines of the French Space Agency and the Vikas engines in India, there is a story of how we cooperated on that front. As far as ISRO and ESA are concerned, I think I would say that the cooperation is really minimal. We could do a lot more together, and we haven't been doing that. So I think with that, I'll hand it back to you, James.
No, thank you. Thanks. That's a very succinct but also knowledgeable answer. Now, what I'm going to do as we get towards the end here, and we just have 5 minutes to go, is first of all, I'm going to ask our 3 experts in reverse order, looking at Paul's recommendations, and there were several, just to quickly give us the one recommendation that they would have chosen as being, the low-hanging fruit or the thing to do right away. I think that would be useful, Paul, just to give a sense of how your recommendations resonated. And then, hopefully, we'll have about 3 minutes left, Paul, 3 minutes, where you can just, take us into port, as it were, with your sort of concluding thoughts and takeaways from the discussion. So that's it. So I'll go in reverse order. So I'll begin, if I may, with Claude-France. Just one recommendation, Claude-France. I mean, if you really thought the two were essential, I'll let you away with that, but I'm only looking for one.
I was sure you would give me this flexibility. I'm not sure it's low-hanging fruit. But for me, the first one is to adapt the procedures for smaller, newer actors to be part of the game. I think it's an terrific asset for our future, and the rhythm is not the proper one. I discovered the rhythm of a startup, and they can die or be prosperous within 3 months, and we don't work at the rhythm of 3 months in the EU and in the national public service. Second, because you allow me, and it's neither a low-hanging fruit, but the rhythm also will be quickly, is what Paul writes about channeling the defense fund. Well, you mentioned the German defense fund. Certainly the German, but also the others, in EU programs, and again, dual programs.
Get the value for the money at the end of the day in long-term capacities. Thank you, Claude-France. So that was succinct, and 2 was perfectly reasonable there. So reverse order. So Tanja, you're next. You're 1, or if you like, 2, but max
2, right?
2 of the recommendations that particularly resonated with you.
Yeah, I'll go for a low-hanging fruit because I'm a fan of adaptive governance, which is a system that we also used in the Hague Working Group on Space Resources that I mentioned. And I think that what will serve both safety and security and sustainability, the 3 S's that we always talk about, is having trackers on objects launched into outer space, so that we know what's up there and can bring them back and avoid them when necessary. And I think my second choice would be related to that, namely space situation awareness and having the data, and having Europe be a proactive actor in that sense, but also looking at allies around the world to unite with, because in the end you need a global system and standardization. So I would pick those 2.
Thank you. And then, Susmita, please, back to you. I know you read the report because, as I said, you told me, so hopefully you got as far as the recommendations. Anything from those recommendations that particularly resonated with you? Just 1, max 2.
I'll go for 2. I think Europe needs to figure out how to not only put in public investment, but also how to get private investment into the space sector, both civilian and defense. Europe has been lagging behind the United States, and I would say lately the way India is going, we're starting to get a lot of traction from private investors. The second recommendation, which I think is a good one, is Germany, as a result of the Ukraine conflict, has really totally shifted their security policy and will be investing $100 billion as a defense fund. So I think Germany should also take the French route and think about strategic autonomy for Europe and for Germany as well.
Thank you. Susmita, thank you very much indeed. So, Paul, I promised you 3 minutes. I lied, I'm afraid, because it's really more like 1 minute, Paul. So, so you're going to have to sort of be super succinct. But give us at least your concluding.
2 minutes from the next session. Listen, I can't possibly sum up such a rich debate. There are a couple of specific questions I just wanted to answer. On GEO and MEO, yes, they are important, and I think I underclubbed them in my report. But what I would say is that I do think there is a bit more regulation around in GEO. By the nature of GEO, there are limited slots, and they are rationed, and licenses obviously are issued, and above all, frequencies are issued. And so the International Telecommunications Union has a role there. So it's slightly less the Wild West. But, you know, Susmita's made the point. A, it's crowded up there, and we're running out of space in GEO. and B, there's a question of fair allocation. And so, those certainly. And MEO, I have to say I'm not enough of a rocket scientist to know the full potential of MEO, but clearly you're right that we have to take advantage of everything that space offers. On your question, sir, all I would say is we can only work with the Europe we have. We may all be able to design a better Europe, but we won't actually be able to implement it in a realistic time frame. We can only work with what we've got. It's the same question about the alphabet soup of agencies involved in space. The membership does not entirely overlap. We have the Swiss and the British sitting here with us today, and neither of them are members of the EU, unfortunately, tragically. And so, it's not going to happen. So we can only work with the agency. And what we need, and I think it's really important, is to try and define rational divisions of labor. And that's what I've tried to do a bit in this report. And one additional division of labor that I'd like to add, which I only barely mentioned in my introduction, was the EU and NATO. When you look at the report, you'll see there's a whole chapter on NATO and NATO getting into space. And NATO is in a funny position because it doesn't have any space assets of its own whatsoever. NATO only has what its member states agree to provide. It's now created a ridiculously small space center in a broom cupboard in Ramstein, so that it's ticked that box because everybody knows that the box had to be ticked. But the fact is that NATO desperately needs data. It needs information in order to be able to build up its space domain awareness. Is it going to get all of that only from the United States? I don't think that would be smart. I don't think it would build confidence necessarily among allies, and also I think that the United States, may be reluctant to give it that much. So there is a clear opportunity for cooperation between the EU and NATO in the space area. So far, space is not one of the 74 areas that NATO and the EU have identified for working together. But I think that's something that should be remedied quickly. And it's an interesting one because it's an area where, for once, the EU might be the senior partner because the EU actually has services it could provide to NATO rather than the other way around. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to everybody for your support, for your criticism, and for your questions, which will lead me to dig deeper.
Thank you. Paul, I echo your thanks, obviously, first and foremost to our three guest experts who came today, or at least came, in the case of Susmita came virtually. Claude-France, thank you for coming up from France, from La Belle Normandie, where I saw you in a very beautiful surrounding last week, so thank you for coming back to Brussels. Tanja, again, thank you for braving the Rotterdam and Antwerp ring roads to come today. We really appreciate it. Obviously, Paul, thanks again for continuing this effort. You never seem to lose your energy and enthusiasm. How many reports? Is it 12 or 13?
This 10th,
yeah.
And there's an 11th to come early next year on the Western Balkans.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to try and put them all together into a book, rework them so as to actually look at, when we've looked at all of these different sectors and countries and regions and situations and industry and so on, what does the defense of Europe look like?
Yeah, particularly with all of the recommendations you've been making over the years, it would be good for a stock take how much of what you suggested then has come to pass. No, I look forward to that, Paul, and we will therefore be back here in 6 months or so for a similar meeting, but looking at the Western Balkans. But anyway, today we have taken you to space and back in an hour and a half. Again, all of you, you know that if you haven't got it already, there are copies of the Paul's report, Running Out of Space, so please help yourselves. To all of you, thank you for being here this afternoon, for participating. Those of you who joined us online, even if I couldn't see you, but thank you too for your support and participation. Obviously, thanks as always to our Peace, Security, Defence team for putting everything together. I promised you Dharmendra, the return of Dharmendra, in about 10 minutes or so for the final session of today. On Africa, Europe, EU cooperation. But in the meantime, I understand there is a coffee break, so please take advantage of that. So goodbye from Town Hall Europe. Paul, some launches are not successful, but this launch, fortunately, has been successful for your report. Thank you.